Prior to 2020, my fight or flight response was generally triggered by situations like, walking down the street at night, scrambling to find an answer when I'm called on for zoning out in class, or taking a bite of the cafeteria's mystery meat of the day. But now that COVID-19 and the quarantine have taken away these activities, there's a new, emotionally draining venture that I get to sweat about. Watching the news! The days of sitting comfortably with the rest of the fam are over. Now, we're like a group of Navy SEALs ready to begin BUD/S training every night. The West Coast is literally on fire. The notorious RBG's gone, and ingesting bleach actually doesn't cure COVID-19. Seriously, I even have to cover my dog's ears in an effort to protect him. Trust me, buddy, you don't want to hear this. So, back in the early pandemic days, as I'm flipping through CNN, 5 days prior to the death of George Floyd at the hands of the police, the University of California announced its decision to phase out their consideration of SAT and ACT scores in their admissions process. And I was like, wait, did I just hear good news? No more Saturday mornings fidgeting in a plastic chair and trying not to cry for 3 hours? Well, 6 Corona months later, on September 1st, the entire UC school system was required by the state court to suspend its use of standardized test results in its admissions process. An era of change, where institutionalized racism is being protested across our nation, and white supremacy is directly confronted. We must address one of the largest contributing factors to racial discrimination that is deeply entrenched in American society: standardized testing. When we believe the myth that these exams are based on merit, we're propping up an additional myth that the existing race and class gaps in standardized test results are due to individual defects, not structural ones. Because as journalist Mariana Vieira states, these exams are the proof of the miles we have left to reach social justice and liberation for all in this country. So if we are intent on eliminating all forms of systemic racism in our nation, we must understand what these tests are truly assessing. Today we will first understand the origins of the SAT and ACT. Next, we'll examine the biases within them. And finally, we'll consider a future of test-optional college admissions. As a senior in the midst of college admissions, I never actually questioned any aspects of the process. Really, I was going into one of the most important stages of my life with a sense of blind trust. While I'm embarrassed by my own ignorance about the components of the standardized testing process, there are some applicants that are disproportionately affected by standardized tests in particular. So first, let's find out who created these exams and what they were initially intended to assess. The story begins in 1926 with a man named Carl Brigham. Brigham, an avowed eugenist, believed that a population could be controlled by the breeding of desired characteristics. 9 years earlier, Brigham had helped create the Army Alpha and Army Beta tests in order to measure the intelligence of recruits and identify those of superior mental ability. According to his 1923 book, A Study of American Intelligence, these tests would prove the racial superiority of white Americans, and that the decline of American intelligence would be more rapid than the decline of European national groups, owing here to the presence of black folks. The College Board, a nonprofit organization that calls itself the nation's College Entrance Examination Board, recruited Carl Brigham to create the Scholastic Aptitude Test, or the SAT. In 1934, Harvard University was the first college to use the SAT as a standard for admission. Immediately after, all universities followed suit. Because, if Harvard's doing it, then it must be right. 20 years later, the ACT was created as competition with the SAT, focusing on practical knowledge rather than cognitive reasoning. The ACT was favored by Midwestern schools who believed that the SAT was elitist. Despite the spirit of competition, the College Board has administered both tests for the past 70 years. Now that we understand why the SAT and ACT were created in the first place, let's examine the racial and economic biases that still exist within these two tests. Recent data from the College Board shows that the SAT performance gap by race is alarmingly wide. Nationwide, 57% of Asian students and 34% of white students scored at least a 1200 on the SAT in 2019, while only 13% of Hispanic students and 8% of Black students were able to achieve this same metric. So, how does such a large gap exist? In his How the SAT Creates Built-in Headwinds, Jay Rosner, a national admissions test expert, explains a process that was used by SAT designers to determine which questions would be included on future tests. The items answered more correctly by Blacks than whites were discarded by the Educational Testing Service. The questions answered by more whites than Blacks were kept. In other words, questions that were placed on future tests were deemed good questions if they replicated outcomes of previous exams. Specifically, tests where Blacks and Latinx students scored lower than their white peers. This further affirms how whiteness is used as a marker of normativity and neutrality. Let's look at a question from the 2005 analogy section of the SAT. Runner is to marathon as A, envoys to embassy. B, martyrs to marathon. C, horses to stable. Or D, oarsman is to regatta. The correct answer is D, oarsman is to regatta, which was selected by 53% of white test takers and only 22% of African American test takers. The problem is that the correct answer requires a body of knowledge that is more likely to come up in the daily lives of affluent white students, rather than the lives of less affluent minority students. Additionally, the American Psychological Association found evidence that the College Board actually places information within passages in order to remind women and people of color of negative stereotypes about them, which increases their test anxiety and leads them to underperform. For instance, there were several examples of stereotype threats in the SAT proctored in May of 2015. The math question involved a chart showing more boys than girls in math classes overall. In the verbal section, asked students to analyze a 19th century polemic, arguing that a woman's place was in the home. And the result of these negative stereotype threats? For 2015, women averaged a score of 496 in math, while men averaged a score of 527. So now let's consider the future of these tests. By first, addressing the movement that has already begun, and second, considering what a future without the SAT and ACT could look like. Now, COVID-19 has brought about a new era within the college admissions process. Some schools have announced that they will be test optional for several years, and some have ditched testing requirements permanently. This shows that colleges really don't need these test results in order to analyze a student's ability to succeed. And the SAT and ACT aren't even testing for knowledge that we've learned in school. Rather, the College Board explains that the SAT and ACT are used to assess a student's readiness for college. But is this really accurate? Researchers at the University of Chicago were curious to find out. They found that high school GPAs were 5 times stronger than SAT and ACT scores at predicting graduation rates, and that the results of GPAs were consistent across all schools, unlike standardized test results. In fact, the study found a negative correlation rate between graduation rates at higher levels of achievement and standardized test results. In an attempt to achieve equity, we must work to provide equal educational opportunities for those who struggle to access them. Although it was difficult for me to accept that racial discrimination exists within the college admission process, a process I initially believed to be free of bias, I'm grateful for this realization. We can no longer support a system that privileges the wealthy and racial majorities. Today, we first understood the origins of the SAT and ACT. Next, the biases within them. And finally, the beginning of a movement to abolish them. Standardized tests enforce the same narrative that we feed off of in the United States, that those who work hard make it. However, after analyzing how the SAT was created to uphold a racial caste system, we now understand that making it isn't based on work ethic. It's based on race, household income, and level of parental education. Our sweat should no longer be spent bending over these exams, rather on working to abolish a system that implicitly discriminates against bodies of students.